There's something quietly stealing your potential every single day. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's not a lack of talent. It's inconsistency. It's that invisible enemy that shows up as excuses, distractions, and a subtle belief that tomorrow will be better without putting in the reps today. From a neuroscience perspective, the brain is not wired for comfort. It's wired for survival, and survival, ironically, has made us seek comfort. But here's the truth. Change doesn't come from feeling motivated. Motivation is unreliable. It fluctuates with your mood, with your sleep, with your blood sugar levels, with your dopamine baseline. If you're relying on motivation to change your life, you're going to lose every time. You want to build something real. You want to develop the kind of self-discipline that reshapes your brain, your habits, and your destiny. Then you have to force yourself to be consistently consistent. Let me explain that. There's a physiological shift that happens in the brain when behavior becomes identity. In neuroscience, this is tied to the basal ganglia, the region responsible for habit formation. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. And systems are nothing more than consistent behavior patterns repeated under pressure, especially when you don't feel like it. Consistency isn't glamorous, no dopamine fireworks, no applause. It's the boring work done day after day, under stress, without the world watching. It's showing up at 5 a.m. to train when it's cold and dark. It's studying when your brain is screaming for distraction. It's hitting publish when no one's paying attention. That's how neuroplasticity is triggered, not by desire, but by repetition. Repeated action wires the brain. Repeated inaction wires regret. Every time you choose to act when it's easier to delay, you're creating a micro-victory, and that rewires your prefrontal cortex. It sharpens your focus. It strengthens your self-control circuits. Dopamine isn't just a pleasure chemical. It's a motivation molecule, and it spikes not only when you achieve, but when you pursue with effort. If you reward the pursuit itself, the brain adapts. It learns to crave challenge. You want to be dangerous, useful, unshakable in the face of adversity. Then you don't get to negotiate with your emotions. You don't get to ask yourself how you feel. You decide, you force yourself to be consistently consistent until it's no longer something you do. It's who you are. The truth is, most people won't. They'll dabble, they'll get excited, burn out, quit, then blame the system or the coach or the schedule. But those who do, those who choose the path of repetition under resistance, they build something permanent. They bend time, they stack wins, and eventually they become the kind of person whose future is inevitable, not accidental. So next time your brain says not today, you say especially today, because that's the exact moment that matters most. That's how consistency becomes identity. That's how identity becomes power. And that's how you become unstoppable. Most people wait for motivation to strike before they act. But here's the problem. Motivation is neurochemically unstable. It's tied to transient brain states, how well you slept, your stress levels, glucose availability, even your gut microbiome. You wake up one morning, you're fired up, dopamine's flowing, prefrontal cortex is online, and action feels easy. But the next day, something's off, you're tired, your dopamine is flat, and suddenly, the task that felt exciting yesterday feels impossible today. This is where most people fall off. They interpret that lack of drive as a signal to wait, but the reality is, that's the exact moment where your real wiring begins. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning, decision making, and suppressing impulses, gets stronger only when it's forced to override discomfort. Not when it's easy, not when it's convenient, but when your system says no, and you say go. The problem with motivation is that it's reactive. It's not designed for sustainability, it's designed for survival. You can't build a career, a physique, a skill, or a legacy based on a brain state that fluctuates with your caffeine intake or the weather. What you need is discipline that activates regardless of your emotional state. That's why you have to force yourself. Not once, not twice, but every time your mind offers you an excuse. This isn't about being robotic. It's about being deliberate. You're not trying to feel like doing the work. You're training your nervous system to expect it. When you act in the absence of motivation, the brain adapts. It builds resilience. It recalibrates your dopamine system to value effort over ease. And that's the neurochemical foundation of consistency. Not the spike of inspiration, but the stability of intention repeated over time. Consistency isn't just a mindset, it's a mechanism. The brain doesn't change because you think about change. It changes because you act repeatedly. That's how neuroplasticity works. When you repeat a behavior, you're literally carving new neural pathways. Axons fire, synapses strengthen, and the behavior starts to shift from effortful to automatic. But that process only happens through repetition, not intensity, not willpower, but sheer volume of consistent exposure. When you brush your teeth, you don't think about it. That's a neural circuit running with almost zero cognitive load. But when you start something new, waking up early, journaling, lifting, coding, reading, whatever the habit is, your brain initially resists. It burns more glucose. It activates your anterior cingulate cortex, the region that detects conflict and error. That's why it feels hard, that's why it feels like friction, but if you stay with it, if you push through that resistance over and over, the brain rewires. What once took conscious effort starts running subconsciously. This is why people who wait for things to get easier never win. Because the brain doesn't change after doing something once or twice. It changes after hundreds, even thousands of exposures. And during that window, that uncomfortable, unglamorous repetition phase, most people quit. Not because they can't, but because they don't understand what's happening inside their own brain. They interpret discomfort as failure instead of growth. But that discomfort, that's the signal, that's the stress the system needs to adapt. The magic isn't in the breakthrough moment, it's in the grind before it. Because every single time you repeat the behavior, you're sending a signal to your nervous system, this matters. And if you keep sending that signal, the brain will respond. It will automate the behavior. It will make it effortless. But only if you earn it through ruthless, deliberate, consistent repetition. There's a specific part of your brain that governs automatic behaviors. It's called the basal ganglia. Think of it as the neurological vault where habits get stored. Once something makes its way in there, it no longer requires active thought or high energy from your prefrontal cortex. It runs in the background like software, quietly, efficiently, reliably. But the only way a behavior gets encoded into the basal ganglia is through repetition under consistency. Not just repetition when you're motivated, not just when it's easy or convenient, but when it's done, no matter what. Early on, every new behavior lives in the high-friction zones of your brain. It demands cognitive effort, emotional regulation, and decision-making bandwidth. That's the prefrontal cortex doing the heavy lifting, but the brain doesn't want to stay there. It's metabolically expensive. So it starts looking for patterns, for signals that this behavior keeps showing up. And when it sees that signal enough times, it starts transferring control to the basal ganglia. That's how a decision becomes a habit. That's how consistency transforms into identity. This is why people say, "I'm just not a disciplined person," because they've never stayed with anything long enough for it to become automated. They're stuck in the loop of short-term dopamine, always quitting before the brain has a chance to offload the behavior into habit storage. But here's the brutal truth. Your basal ganglia doesn't care what kind of habit it stores. It's not moral. It's mechanical. If you repeat procrastination, that's what gets coded. If you repeat skipping workouts, that becomes your baseline. But if you show up every day with zero negotiation, that's what gets locked in. That's when the hard becomes normal. That's when consistency becomes who you are, not what you try to do. And the moment it shifts, when the basal ganglia takes over, that's when the resistance drops. That's when it gets quiet in your head. That's when you don't need to talk yourself into it anymore, because the system is already running the loop. But you only get there through relentless consistency, not perfection, not intensity, but non-negotiable follow-through. Day after day, until the brain has no choice but to comply, we often think dopamine is just about pleasure, that it spikes when we achieve something, when we win, when we cross the finish line. But that's only part of the picture. What most people don't realize is that dopamine plays an even more powerful role during pursuit, during effort. It's the molecule of motivation, not just reward. And you can train your dopamine system to fire not when you succeed, but when you try. That distinction is critical because if you only reward yourself when the outcome is perfect, you're conditioning your brain to only value results. But if you reward the process, the act of showing up, the grind, the struggle, you're rewiring your system to fall in love with effort. This is neurochemistry. When you acknowledge the work, when you give yourself a hit of internal recognition for consistency, you're raising your dopamine baseline. That means your motivation becomes less dependent on external rewards, likes, validation, applause, and more connected to the internal satisfaction of pushing through. Over time, your brain starts to associate challenge with anticipation. You begin to crave the reps. You begin to feel more alive not when things are easy, but when you're deep in the middle of doing something hard consistently. Think about that. Your system can actually start to release more dopamine during the workout than after. During the reading session, the writing, the coding, the studying, not when it's over, but while you're in the fight. That's a massive shift, and the only way to create it is through repeated pairing of effort with internal reward. You literally train the brain to chase friction instead of flee from it. This is where consistency takes on a biochemical advantage. Because the more you do the hard thing and tell yourself, this is the good part, the more your brain starts to believe it. And once that connection is made, effort equals dopamine. Now you're not just disciplined. You're wired for it. You're neurologically designed to chase the process. And that's when consistency becomes sustainable, not because it's easy, but because it feels right. Every time you push yourself to act when your brain is begging you not to, you're creating what I call a micro-victory. These aren't grand, headline-making wins. They're the small moments of decision, the internal battles won quietly but profoundly. Each micro-victory sends a powerful signal to your prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for self-control, planning, and executive function. It says, I am capable. I can override my impulses. I can choose action over inaction. Neuroscientifically, this matters because the prefrontal cortex isn't a fixed muscle. It's a dynamic system that strengthens with use. Like lifting weights, every time you resist the urge to quit, procrastinate, or distract yourself, you're training this part of the brain to become more resilient and more efficient. Over time, those micro-victories compound. They build a neural architecture that supports sustained focus and self-discipline. What's fascinating is that these small wins also modulate your dopamine system. They give you a little hit, not a flood, but enough to reinforce your sense of accomplishment and encourage you to repeat the behavior. That's why consistency matters more than intensity. You don't need to have massive breakthroughs every day. You need to build a habit of showing up, especially when it feels difficult or pointless. Because those moments, the ones you fight through silently, are the ones that wire your brain for long-term success. If you skip these micro-victories, if you wait for some external validation or a surge of motivation, your brain remains stuck in reactive mode. But if you cultivate them deliberately, you start to take control of your own neurochemistry. You become the architect of your future self. And that's how small decisions, repeated relentlessly, become the foundation for monumental change. The brain's primary job is survival, and survival means seeking comfort, minimizing threat, and conserving energy. This evolutionary wiring makes comfort incredibly seductive. It's why when faced with a difficult task, your nervous system immediately pushes back, signaling, stay here, it's safe. But progress, growth, and transformation don't happen in comfort zones. They happen on the edges of discomfort, where your brain and body are challenged beyond their current limits. Here's the catch. Comfort feels good in the moment, but it rewires your brain to avoid the very activities that build resilience and capacity. When you choose comfort, you're reinforcing neural pathways that make avoidance easier, motivation lower, and discipline weaker. The brain learns what you repeat, yes, but it also learns what you consistently avoid. So the more you seek ease, the more your brain and body adapt to that ease as the new normal. If you want to force yourself to be consistently consistent, you have to accept that discomfort is not an obstacle but a necessary ingredient. It's the signal that your brain is rewiring, that your nervous system is being challenged. The resistance you feel isn't your enemy, it's the catalyst for change. To push past comfort means to engage your autonomic nervous system in a new way. When you lean into discomfort, your brain releases stress hormones like cortisol, which in controlled doses actually enhance neuroplasticity. This stress primes your brain to learn and adapt. Over time, by deliberately stepping into discomfort regularly, you recalibrate your nervous system to tolerate higher levels of challenge without shutting down. So consistency is really about building tolerance for discomfort. It's about creating a new baseline where your brain no longer views hard work as threat, but as opportunity. That shift is fundamental, because if you keep running from discomfort, your potential remains locked behind the very comfort you chase. But if you make discomfort your daily companion, you rewire your brain for resilience, focus, and relentless forward momentum. Your brain is constantly constructing your sense of self, and one of the most powerful ways it does this is through the behaviors you repeat. This is the fundamental principle behind identity formation. Identity follows behavior. It's not about deciding who you want to be first and hoping your actions will catch up. It's about showing up consistently in a way that sends your brain a clear message. This is who I am. Every time you force yourself to act, especially when you don't feel like it, you're reinforcing neural circuits that represent a specific identity. These circuits become stronger with use, making the behavior easier to perform and the identity more deeply ingrained. The prefrontal cortex, which governs self-reflection and planning, continuously updates your self-model based on your actions. Over time, repeated behaviors solidify into an automatic sense of self, creating a feedback loop that supports the very habits you want to build. This is why inconsistency is so dangerous. When your actions don't align with your intentions, your brain receives conflicting signals. It's like trying to build a foundation on shifting sand. Without consistent behavior, your identity remains vague, unstable, and easily swayed by external circumstances or emotions. But when you force yourself to be consistently consistent, you create a stable neural representation of who you are, someone disciplined, focused, resilient. This shift isn't just psychological, it's physiological. The brain's networks for self-awareness, motivation, and habit formation integrate, reinforcing a coherent identity that aligns with your repeated actions. And once your brain believes in this identity, you experience less internal conflict. The effort required to maintain these behaviors decreases because they become part of your default mode of operating. So the power lies not in waiting to feel like it, or hoping for an identity breakthrough, but in the relentless repetition of behaviors that reflect the person you want to be. Each time you act consistently, you're essentially updating your brain's version of you, making that identity more real, more automatic, and ultimately, more unshakable. True consistency reveals itself not when conditions are perfect, but when everything inside and outside is working against you. The real test and where growth happens is under pressure. When you're tired, distracted, stressed, or discouraged, and yet you still choose to show up, that's where your brain builds resilience and power. This isn't just motivational talk. It's rooted deeply in neurobiology. Under stress, your nervous system shifts into what we call a state of heightened arousal. Stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine flood your brain, making it harder to focus, more prone to impulsivity, and more sensitive to discomfort. Most people interpret this as a signal to quit or avoid the challenge. But if you learn to act in spite of this state, to engage the prefrontal cortex and suppress the fight or flight reflex, you're literally strengthening the circuits that regulate self-control and emotional regulation. Repeatedly choosing action under pressure trains your brain's capacity to manage stress without collapsing into avoidance or procrastination. This process strengthens the connections between your prefrontal cortex and limbic system, effectively increasing your tolerance for discomfort and uncertainty. You become less reactive, more deliberate. Your brain starts to expect challenge, and instead of resisting, it adapts. This is why elite performers across fields emphasize showing up no matter what. It's not about being perfect. It's about becoming someone whose baseline behavior is to engage under adversity. That neural adaptation is what transforms stress from a liability into an asset. When you force yourself to be consistent under pressure, you build a neurological foundation of toughness that transcends motivation or temporary willpower. You build a system that keeps moving forward even when your brain is screaming to stop. And that's the hallmark of true power, being unstoppable precisely because you've trained your nervous system to keep showing up, no matter the circumstances. Goals are powerful. They give you direction, a target to aim for, but they are inherently unstable because they rely on moments of motivation and bursts of energy that inevitably fluctuate. The brain loves goals because they trigger dopamine spikes when achieved, but those spikes are fleeting. What really shapes behavior over the long term is your systems, the daily routines, the rituals, the consistent behaviors that operate independently of your mood or circumstance. Systems are the neurological scaffolding upon which habits are built. When you focus solely on goals, you risk creating a feast or famine cycle of effort. You push hard when the goal is front and center, but when the dopamine-driven thrill fades, your brain looks for an excuse to ease off. That's where inconsistency sneaks in, but when you design a system, a framework of repeated, manageable actions, you're engaging your brain's habit, forming machinery. These systems take advantage of the basal ganglia's ability to automate behavior, reducing the need for constant conscious effort. Moreover, systems are about process over outcome. Instead of fixating on a distant result, systems keep your brain engaged in the here and now, rewarding the pursuit itself. This keeps dopamine levels more stable, sustaining motivation through repetition rather than depending on the unpredictable highs of goal completion. When you align your identity with your systems, you build a self-reinforcing loop where daily actions affirm who you are and what you do. That loop rewires your brain to expect and crave the process, not just the prize. So rather than asking yourself, did I reach my goal today? Ask, did I follow my system? Because it's the system, your consistent behaviors, that ultimately drives lasting change. Goals light the path, but systems carry you there. Your future self isn't shaped by big, dramatic moments. It's forged in the accumulation of countless small, consistent choices made every single day. Neuroscience shows us that the brain continuously adapts based on the patterns it experiences most frequently. Every action you repeat, every habit you reinforce, subtly reshapes your neural architecture, gradually making certain behaviors easier and more automatic. This means the version of you 5 years from now is, quite literally, the sum of what you do today, tomorrow, and the day after that. It's not about occasional bursts of effort or sporadic intensity. It's about the relentless repetition of behaviors that wire your brain toward growth, discipline, and resilience. The synapses that fire together wire together, and through this process, you are building the pathways that define your future capabilities, mindset, and identity. When you force yourself to be consistently consistent, you aren't just ticking boxes or grinding through tasks, you're engineering your brain's future state. You are creating neural circuits that support high performance, focus, and self-regulation. You're programming your nervous system to expect challenge, to manage stress, and to recover efficiently. This isn't theoretical, it's measurable and observable in brain imaging studies, so every moment of choice matters. The small decisions to show up, to act, to persist, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable, stack like bricks in a foundation. Ignore these moments, and you slowly build a future limited by inaction and scattered effort. Embrace them, and you construct a future where your potential becomes inevitable, where your progress becomes unstoppable. Consistency isn't just a habit, it's the architecture of your future self, and the only way to build it is through unyielding, daily commitment to the process.